Good evening. My name is John Linder. Welcome to the On Caring for a Common Home and Caring for Our Common Home, Climate Change and the Moral Imperative. Like I said, my name is John Linder. I am the co-chair of Social Justice Action at St. Boniface Church. I am delighted to chair a group of parishioners that work on issues of immigration, healthcare, criminal justice reform, and the environment. I am really excited that you are able here to attend tonight's conversation. This has been a year in the making. We actually originally had this plan for May of 2020, and then the pandemic got in the way. And so now we're here, and we're delighted that you can all join us tonight. I do want to call out my committee specifically for helping make this possible. Jan Horn, could not have done it without you. Liz Beggett, Christine Maloro, and Ben Koulos, thank you all for all of your hard work on this event. This wouldn't be possible if it wasn't for you guys. Tonight's event on Caring for the Common Home is co-sponsored by the Brooklyn Oratory parishes of St. Boniface and the Assumption of the Blessed Virgin Mary, the Sabin Center for Climate Change Law, St. Francis Xavier's Environmental Ministry, Pace University, Trinity Church Wall Street, Pax Christi USA, Center for Earth Ethics, Food and Water Watch, 350 Brooklyn, Metro New York Catholic Climate Movement, Central Brooklyn Independent Democrats, New York State Senator Brian Kavanaugh, and Brooklyn for Peace. Thank you so much for all your support of this event. It's exciting. It's now my pleasure to introduce my pastor, Father Mark Lane, to just give us a few opening remarks.
Hi, good evening, everyone. Thanks, John, for the introduction. With Father Michael, I want to make sure that we thank everyone for being part of the evening, and particularly Professor Gerrard, Senator Kavanaugh, and Corinna Gore. We're deeply honored by your presence. Thank you to the Social Action Committee for all the work that's made this possible. This is a vitally important work for our parish communities. We believe that our Catholic faith compels us to act responsibly with the resources and the gifts given to each of us. We believe that we share this planet with others, with our sisters and brothers, wherever they might live, and with all creatures who call our shared earth home. As parish communities, we are dedicated to being a part of the solution and to do our part to not keep contributing to the problem. We believe that our faith takes its direction, obviously, from Jesus, who saw people's pain, who felt their exclusion, and felt the indifference of the powerful towards those often unseen at their doorsteps. He was moved with compassion and pity and gave his own life out of love so others could live. It is an unmistakable aspect of the life of Jesus that he had a particular care for the poor and the marginalized, not least because those who bear the greatest burden of the world's problems are always the poor. This fact has come home to me many times over the years in our work with our sister parish in Turkana, a province in the northwest of Kenya in East Africa. The parish, St. Mark's, is a small town called Lokitong, nestled in the hills above Lake Turkana, the world's largest desert lake. Those hills are part of the Lepur Range, the northern edge of the Great Rift Valley Depression. In the local language, Lepur is the word for leper, the large wild cat, once common in sub-Saharan Africa. Turkana is a ruggedly semi-arid region, and trust me, there are no lepers or any large carnivores in that area, not anymore anyway. The only trees are the distinctive thorny acacia trees we all know so well, and most of the ground is bare earth and naked rocks. When I learnt that many of the local place names referred to animals and environments that no longer exist, I realized that the harsh conditions were not always the case for the people in that land. Over the years, and increasingly in recent years, the people of Turkana have endured extended periodic droughts, as well as the effects of desertification, which is slowly making its way down all of Africa. The impact on families already living a marginal existence has been devastating. On one visit, we met children as young as 5 years of age, sleeping behind the shops and hotels feeding off their garbage. I will always recall waking up one morning complaining about another day eating canned tuna and rice and seeing a kid outside my door licking the inside of a can I had casually discarded the evening before. With the decrease in travel and commerce due to COVID, there has been a decrease in garbage and therefore food for these kids. The kids sniff glue to help ameliorate the excruciating and enduring pains of hunger. Gravity rules in all things. All heavy things fall to the lowest point, and those at the bottom are the least able to cope. The impact of climate change is personal, and we believe, as Pope Francis has clearly stated, that the reality of climate change cannot be left to a future generation. Now is the time to act. So again, thank you all for being here tonight. May we learn and may we feel tonight more so that we can ensure that no 5-year-old has to sniff glue to cope with hunger, but instead move us to dedicate ourselves to ensuring their inheritance is an Eden where all can live with dignity and security. Again, thank you everyone for participating.
Thank you, Mark. Now I'm delighted to actually put welcome a couple of our dignitaries and put them on the spot. I'm going to start first with Corinna Gore. Corinna Gore is the founder and director of the Center for Earth Ethics at the Union Theological Seminary. The Center for Earth Ethics bridges the worlds of religion, academia, policy, and culture to discern and pursue the changes that are necessary to stop ecological destruction and create a society that values a long-term health of the whole. She's also an ex officio member of the faculty of the Earth Institute at Columbia University. Ms. Gore's previous experiences include serving as the director of the Union Forum at the Union Theological Seminary, legal work at Simpson, Thacher, and Bartlett, and in the Legal Center for Sanctuary for Families, and serving as the director of community affairs for the Association to Benefit Children. Currently, she's serving on the board of ABC and Riverkeeper. She's also a writer and author of Lighting the Way, 9 Women Who Changed Modern America. Ms. Gore is a graduate of Harvard College, Columbia Law School, and Union Theological Seminary. She lives in New York with her 3 children. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And greetings to each and every one of you here. I am Corinna. I am the founder and director of Center for Earth Ethics at Union Theological Seminary. We draw from the world's faith and wisdom traditions to face and resolve the ecological crisis, including the climate emergency. And I'm delighted to be with you tonight for 3 reasons. One is that convening dialogue is a powerful way to make change, because it is not just about a performance or a show of sorts. It's about building relationships and exchanging ideas and stoking political will. So I am very grateful to the St. Boniface Council for Social Justice for making that happen tonight. And thanks to all the other co-hosts as well. Center for Earth Ethics is very proud to be a co-host. Second, Laudato Si is a powerful work that has influenced the mission and vision and approach of the Center for Earth Ethics, as well as influenced me personally. And it lays out some critical concepts and frames for all of us to teach and work from. When I was reflecting on it this afternoon, there were 2 concepts that stood out to me: a culture of care and also ecological citizenship. In order to change the trajectory of ecological destruction that the climate crisis is the most severe symptom of, we must make deep changes to both laws and policies and also culture. And a moral imperative, as this program offers as its starting point, is the only way that is powerful enough to do that. And finally, I am delighted to be here to support and learn from Michael Gerrard. He has been a friend and colleague to the Center for Earth Ethics and to me. He's graciously come into our classrooms and programs, and he's also invited us into his world at Columbia University. He really understands that this is an issue that is not just about data and science and technology and economics, as important as those things are. It is also about morals and values and vision. And he is not only a legendarily sharp intellect and a savvy lawyer, he's a thoughtful and principled leader and a real force for justice. So this is a very special program indeed. I'm really happy to be here, and I thank you for inviting me, and turn it back to the moderator.
Thank you, Corinna. I appreciate you being here. It's now time. Now I'm actually get to do the exciting part. I get to introduce Michael. Michael Gerrard is the Andrew Sabin Professor of Professional Practice at Columbia Law School. He teaches courses on environmental law, energy law, and climate change law. He's the founder and faculty director for the Sabin Center for Climate Change Law. He's the former chair of faculty of Columbia's Earth Institute. He's the former chair of the American Bar Association section of Environment, Energy, and Resources. He's practiced environmental law full-time in New York since 1979 through 2008, most recently as a partner in charge of New York's office of a major law firm. Rated by several independent services as a leading environmental lawyer in New York and one of the leading environmental lawyers in the world. He has authored and edited 13 books and hundreds of articles on environmental law. He lectured on environmental law in 19 countries around the world, including Vatican City, as you will hear him discuss now. So Michael, the floor is yours. I'm going to make you host.
Thank you. Thank you so much, John. It's really a pleasure to be with all of you this evening. Thank you for your kind introduction. And Corinna, thank you so much for your kind words. So I'm going to start by telling the story of how I became involved in the issue of climate migration and then became interested in human trafficking. And I'll talk about some of the ways that faith communities are involved and have a very important role. So in 2010, shortly after I joined the faculty at Columbia Law School, I unexpectedly received a call from the ambassador to the United Nations from the Republic of the Marshall Islands. And he said, some decade, we don't know what decade, but some decade we are going to be underwater. And that raises a whole host of novel legal questions. If a country is underwater, is it still a state? Does it still have a seat at the United Nations? Who will take us in? What will be the rights of our people if and when we relocate? Do we have legal recourse against those who did it to us? So the first question I had to ask is, where the heck are the Marshall Islands? So the answer is, here they are. They are in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, about halfway between Australia and Hawaii. Growing out of that call from the ambassador, my center at Columbia and the Republic of the Marshall Islands held a conference on legal issues faced by threatened island nations. We published a book with the proceedings of the conference, and I've traveled to the Marshall Islands twice. So they're a nation of 29 atolls, and I'm going to be talking this evening about Majuro, which is the capital atoll, and Bikini and Enuitak. So this is Majuro, and atolls are basically the coral formations on top of extinct volcanoes. So it's basically the rim of this extinct volcano has coral, and there are about 30,000 people who live there. This is the airport. When you land at the airport, you see this sign, and you go on the one road that goes through the middle of the atoll, and it is very thin. You can, in some parts like this one, see the lagoon on the left side and the Pacific Ocean on the right side. This area used to be covered with trees, but that has been washed away. I took these pictures during one of my trips. The owner of this house tried to put up some rocks as a seawall, but as you can see, that doesn't accomplish much. Their cemeteries are above ground. I was told that there used to be another row of these graves, these memorials here. This one is going to be falling into the sea, and then there's another one behind that, another row behind that, which is also in danger. So the principal danger, of course, is flooding. This sort of thing happens with increasing frequency. This home is built on stilts, which is enough to withstand a little bit of a flood, but not a very large flood. Here again is the airport. The airport serves double duty as the principal source of drinking water for Majuro. They traditionally use groundwater, but the groundwater has been become salty because of the sea washing over it. So when it rains, they capture the rainwater runoff from the runway, and that's what they drink, except when the runway is underwater, in which case they can't draw water from there, and airplanes can't land or take off. Some of the homes, with some economic assistance from the European Union, have installed these barrels that capture the rain from the roof. This is a Catholic school in Majuro, and it's sort of an assembly area, but it's a water tank underneath so that they can store water. This is a school bus on the picking up children on the one road through the middle of the atoll. And this is a bus stop with the children waiting for the bus. So these children are the future of the Marshall Islands. The past of the Marshall Islands is signified by this. During the Cold War, the United Nations conducted its outdoor nuclear weapons testing program in the Marshall Islands. They detonated 67 nuclear weapons. This one was over Bikini Atoll. This was over Eniwetok Atoll. There were these explosions were so frequent that people would go and watch the nuclear bombs go off. They needed to move everybody off of Bikini and Eniwetok while they were doing this. And so the king of Bikini agreed to evacuate his people from the island. He received the thanks of President Truman for doing that. They thought that they were advancing the cause of peace. This is one of the families that was relocated. But the United States government, the military, conducted its relocation in a way where they took them to other islands that, and turns out some of them were themselves not very habitable. They couldn't grow food. They were starving. They were moved from island to island. And the US government conducted medical experiments with some of the people here in a way that the United Nations Human Rights body has subsequently considered to be a violation of human rights. When the US government was getting ready to leave the Marshall Islands in the 1970s, they decided that Bikini was, forget it, it would be uninhabitable for at least 25,000 years because of the contamination. But Eniwetok, they wanted to clean up to make it habitable again. So much of the waste they just bulldozed into the lagoon, but there were also fragments of plutonium from a bomb that didn't detonate, and they wanted to get rid of those more safely. So they went to the crater that had been left behind by one of the smaller bombs, a mere hydrogen bomb, merely the size of the Hiroshima weapon. And they threw that plutonium and other radioactive waste in the pit and covered it over with an 18-inch thick shell of cement and left. I had the occasion to visit this place called Rooted Island. The US government acknowledges that this thin shell is vulnerable to being blown off in a strong typhoon. When I walked on it briefly and without preparation and without a Geiger counter, I noted grass coming between the gaps in the cement. But the government says, the US government says, don't worry, it's not so bad if all the radiation inside this is released outside, because the area around this shell is so radioactive already from all the weapons testing and the fallout that releasing this wouldn't make it any worse. Bikini, as I said, it has been deemed to be uninhabitable, but it still has a town hall on Majuro on the capital island, so that the displaced residents of Bikini can go and collect food stamps and other kinds of of benefits. And the displaced people of Bikini still elect a member to the parliament of the Marshall Islands. I indicated I visited the local Catholic school. This was one of the student projects, displaying pictures of the atomic bombs that had been dropped on their country. In the bar at the airport, they display one of the bombs, and the largest explosion was called the Bravo shot, and so they've named a drink after the Bravo shot. So the Marshall Islands are now an independent, democratically elected country. In 1986, the US, which had assumed protectorate status over the Marshall Islands, gave them their independence. So they now elect a president and a parliament. And part of the deal, part of this 1986 Compact of Free Association, as it's called, is that people from the Marshall Islands may freely go to the United States and work here. They don't need a visa. They can stay permanently. They don't have a path to citizenship, but their children who are born in the US automatically become US citizens. About 20 years ago, one of the people who had gone from the migrated from the Marshall Islands to the US. The way you do that, if you're going from the US to the Marshall Islands, you fly to Honolulu and take one of the 3 weekly flights to Majuro. So this fellow had gone in the opposite direction, and he had sort of randomly gotten a job in Springfield, Arkansas, at Springdale, Arkansas, Northwest Arkansas, at a Tyson's chicken plant. The job went well. That plant was previously employed a lot of Mexicans, but the Mexicans became illegal under changes to the immigration laws. The Marshallese were legal. And so this fellow had a cousin come over, and one thing led to another. And now more than 10,000, some people say as many as 15,000 Marshallese have moved to Springdale, Arkansas, and the area around Springdale, and hundreds or thousands of them work for Tyson's, processing the chickens. The government of the Marshall Islands established a consulate in Springdale next to a barber shop. People who are campaigning to be president of the Marshall Islands travel to Springdale to campaign and ask people to put in absentee ballots. I visited the consulate. Here I am with the consul general under a picture of the then president of the Marshall Islands, and I met with some of the senior members of the Marshallese community. Now, the Tyson's plant, like a large number of these large poultry processing plants, has not been especially diligent during the pandemic. And so there's been a high incidence of COVID at the plant. But people continue to come over from the Marshall Islands to the United States, especially to Springdale, because there are jobs in Springdale. Their kids can get education in Springdale, and there are no jobs in the Marshall Islands. The Marshall Islands has almost no economy. They do have a plant that makes copra, makes product soap from coconut, but otherwise they have very few jobs there, and the future of the country is dismal because of sea level rise. We don't know when the Marshall Islands will become uninhabitable. We do know that a place becomes uninhabitable before it is submerged, because the flooding is so frequent and it is so dangerous, and because the saltwater the salt water destroys the fresh water that they drink. There's no way to grow food. So it becomes uninhabitable. We don't know exactly when that will happen. The principal hope for the Marshall Islands is international action, strong international action to greatly reduce the greenhouse gas emissions that are causing the seas to rise. And the most hopeful moment was in Paris in 2015 at COP21, the 21st Conference of the Parties to the United Nations Framework Convention on climate change. And here I am outside their offices at the Paris conference. The conference ended in triumph. Here you see Ban Ki-moon, the Secretary General of the United Nations, and Minister of the French Foreign Minister, and the President of France, and everyone celebrating the triumph of the Paris Climate Agreement. But the essence of the Paris Climate Agreement was that every country put on the table its voluntary, non-binding, non-enforceable pledges for reducing greenhouse gas emissions. In Paris, they also decided that the maximum tolerable increase in global temperatures would be 2 degrees centigrade, 3.6 degrees Fahrenheit, above pre-industrial conditions. But the Marshall Islands and other small island nations said that's not good enough. At 2 degrees, we're underwater. We need a goal of 1.5 degrees. So in Paris as well, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change was given the task of studying the difference between 2 degrees and 1.5 degrees. In 2008, they came out with a study saying that the Marshall Islands are right. At 2 degrees, terrible things happen ecologically. Not only are the small island nations underwater, but we have mass extinction of species, mass migration, all kinds of terrible things happen. But the Paris Climate Agreement just called for each country to put on the table its own voluntary pledges. And regrettably, they didn't add up to nearly enough. So what this shows is out to the year 2050, we have the total greenhouse gas emissions emitted by the world. And so this is what they actually were. Here is what the policies are that are, I'm sorry, this is what the actual trends are. This is the trends. These are some policies that are on the books. These are what the Paris pledges do. This is what these voluntary pledges, which only go out for the most part to 2030, do. This is where emissions would need to be if we were to stay at 2 degrees. This is where emissions would need to be if we were to be at 1.5 degrees. So we are way off. Everybody in Paris in 2015 acknowledged that fact. And so the plan was every 5 years, all the countries would come back and come forward with more ambitious pledges. So the 5 years were up last year in 2020. Only 11 countries came back with more ambitious pledges, not budging these lines much at all. So what does the future bring as a result of this? These are various scenarios from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change for sea level rise out to the end of the century under different emissions scenarios. And the worst case scenario that is depicted here would have sea level rise of 8 feet, 2.4 meters. More recent evidence shows that maybe this isn't actually the worst case because of some recent findings about what's happening with the West Antarctic ice sheet. But in any event, the highest point in the Marshall Islands is just 2 meters. And even before this, the place is uninhabitable, even if it's not completely underwater. Now, it's not only the Marshall Islands and the other small island nations that are endangered by the various aspects of climate change. This is a sketch from the UN of what kind of actions might lead to displacement of people as a result of climate change. Now, it's mislabeled in the sense that it talks about climate change refugees. Actually, there's no such thing. People who are displaced by climate change do not fit within the legal definition of refugees, which is people who are fleeing persecution or the reasonable threat of persecution. People who are fleeing climate change don't count, but in any event, and that's been adjudicated a couple of places, there are many actions that, many impacts that could lead to mass migration. Some of it is flooding and sea level rise. Some of it is drought and desertification, which has especially afflicted the Sahel region of Africa and some other parts of the country. Numerically, the place that has the most places and most people at risk is Bangladesh. Bangladesh, it's been estimated, will lose about 17% of its land area with every meter of sea level rise. You can see here the places in Bangladesh that are at or very close to sea level. And it's not only the places that are at or close to sea level, it's also inland because the rivers also rise and cause enormous flooding. And it's not only flooding because the water becomes too salty to drink. And in significant parts of the country, that has already happened. And so there's no drinking water. And it's not only Bangladesh. To the west of Bangladesh is India, which has its own large and vulnerable coastline. And to the west of India is Pakistan, which has its own large and vulnerable coastline. So there are about 175 million people in Bangladesh. They'll try to move inland, they'll try to move up the country, but there isn't enough land and ability to grow food and get clean water for them all to just cram into the land that is left. And many of them will inevitably try to go toward India. But India will be facing its own severe problems with climate change. And the history of that region does not leave one with confidence that that large numbers of people from Bangladesh will be welcomed with open arms into India. And there's already a fence that covers some of the border, but it's very porous. A lot of people on a slow basis are moving over. The most recent authoritative study of the number of people who might be displaced around the world by climate change came from the World Bank in 2018. They looked at 2050, and they, said they were looking at internal migration, the people who will try to migrate within their country. But we know that in many of these countries that won't be possible, and many people will try to go to other countries. So they estimated that by 2050, at current rate of greenhouse gas emissions and emission growth, there'll be 143 million internal climate migrants in these three regions: 86 million in sub-Saharan Africa, 40 million in South Asia, and 17 million in Latin America. We know that already many people are trying to flee to other places. Many people from Africa have tried to get into Europe. Many people from Latin America have tried or trying to get into the United States. And so we already have disasters, floods, typhoons, earthquakes, wildfires that are causing internal displacement. Here are the places, the internally displaced people by disasters as of the end of 2019. Then on top of that are the people who are displaced by war and conflict and violence. And even larger numbers of people are displaced by conflict and violence. This displacement makes a lot of people extremely vulnerable. Often they fall into the hands of smugglers who promised to get them safely across the border. We saw in the effort by people to cross the Mediterranean that often they would be put on unsound, overcrowded boats that often overturned with loss of life. We also know that the people engaged in these kinds of smuggling also often engage in human trafficking. They take vulnerable people and they create what can only be called a form of modern day slavery. And this has been linked to climate change. The more people who are being forced to migrate, the more people are subject to these terrible conditions, and a disproportionate number of them are women, and many women are subjected to sex trafficking. Many of the men are subjected to labor trafficking. We also see in Bangladesh the phenomenon that families are forced to marry off their daughters to get the money to move to another location. We have seen repeated incidents where natural disasters have led to documented trafficking. And I'm listing just a few of these instances here, but it's a global phenomenon. One of the places that has been afflicted by one form of this is the Marshall Islands. A couple of extraordinarily unscrupulous people came up with a scheme that poor pregnant women in the Marshall Islands would be lured to the U.S. and their flights would be paid for in exchange for giving up their baby. This fellow, who was an elected official in Arizona, was arrested and charged with human trafficking through this adoption scheme, luring pregnant women from the Marshall Islands. This is the same fellow a year later, after he was sentenced to 6 years in prison for human trafficking because of what he did with the Marshall Islands. One of the people who is most concerned about human trafficking is Pope Francis. And in 2016, Pope Francis convened in Vatican City a conference mostly of judges and lawyers around the world to talk about the problem of human trafficking and to focus on the fact that the people who ought to be prosecuted are not the victims of this. It's the traffickers, and to try to bring more attention in the legal, the prosecutorial community to this issue. So this was called the Judges Summit on Human Trafficking and Organized Crime. Pope Francis, of course, as has been mentioned, and others will talk in more detail about it later on, is also one of the world's greatest environmental champions. And Laudato Si is a remarkable work on the importance of preserving the environment. Because the environment and climate change are such great concerns of the Pope, I had the great honor of being invited by the Vatican to attend this conference and to speak about the link between climate change and human trafficking. And so this is the conference in Vatican City. This is a group of us assembled. Here's the Pope. Here I am in back. And I have to say that my favorite souvenir from this trip, which I picked up not in the Vatican gift shop, but at a gift shop near the Trevi Fountain, was the solar Pope. This is a little solar panel, and when it's in the sun, his hand waves. but in any event, this is sitting on the shelf of my office at Columbia Law School, where I haven't been in more than a year, but I hope to go back there soon. I wrote this article about the legal issues for a law review about climate change and human trafficking after the Paris Agreement, and argued that there was, the Paris Agreement did not go nearly far enough. And the world is going to be facing just very large amounts of migration. I had the opportunity to talk to a special meeting of the United Nations Security Council about the issues with mass migration, and giving my views that this is an issue of such international importance that the Security Council should take it up as a matter of great concern. It's also a matter of unfathomable unfairness. So carbon dioxide emissions per capita. Carbon dioxide, of course, is the most important greenhouse gas, what is causing the climate change and the sea level rise and these other impacts that we're seeing. And we see the countries with the highest per capita carbon dioxide emissions are, the darkest in red, the United States, Canada, Saudi Arabia, Australia. Ukraine is not far behind. And then, slightly lower, but still very high, Russia and several of the countries of Europe. So these are the countries that are principally responsible for the climate change that we're seeing. China has become the largest emitter. Around 2007, it surpassed the US as the largest emitter, but the US is still the largest contributor to the cumulative load of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. The poorest countries, the countries that contribute the least to climate change, these are the countries with the number of people without access to electricity. And, unsurprisingly, it's in terms of the numbers, it's mostly sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia, and as well as Indonesia, Philippines, New Guinea, Papua New Guinea, those parts of the world are contributing the least to climate change. They don't even have electricity. There are various measures of the vulnerability of countries to climate change, but this is one. And it's similar to the countries that don't have electricity. And it is the exact opposite of the countries that have contributed the most to climate change. In other words, the countries that are most hurt by climate change are the countries that have done the least to cause climate change. It is one of the world's greatest injustices, and it affects billions of people. One indication of the amount of inequality that's involved is looking at the population distribution of contributions to carbon dioxide emissions. And so the richest 10% of the global population is responsible for almost half of the globe's CO2 emissions. The poorest half of the world's population are responsible for only about 10% of the world's greenhouse gas emissions. These, of course, are the people who will be displaced by climate change. And these are the people who did essentially nothing to cause climate change. The trends, so here are global average temperatures, going back to around 1860 when temperature readings began. And as you can see, they go up and down on a, from year to year, but the trend is unmistakable. The warmest 5 years in recorded history are the last 5 years. And the trends at current rates of greenhouse gas emissions will take us to this 1.5 degree level by around 2036 and 2 degrees by 2063. So if this is right, you know, and there are a lot of uncertainties that go into these, but if this is right, you know, the Marshall Islands will be pretty much gone by then, or will be doomed because the melting of the ice has so accelerated. So it's the cumulative emissions that are causing the warming. Carbon dioxide stays in the atmosphere for a century or more. And so warming is occurring now partly as a result of emissions from a century ago, and some even longer. So if we look at the cumulative contribution of different countries to the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, you know, from 1750 to 1900, there was very little of it, so that doesn't really count. But we see the U.S. is far and away the largest contributor to the cumulative load of greenhouse gas emissions in the world. China is a little over half, although it's gaining on us, and the time will come when China has exceeded the U.S. But right now, and for some decades to come, the U.S. will be the largest contributor. So my argument is that what would be fair would be for each major emitting country to accept a portion of the world's climate displaced people in proportion to their contribution of greenhouse gases to the atmosphere. The US is responsible for about 25% of the total load. And so it would be fair if the US were to take in 25% of the people displaced by climate change. It would also be fair if the US would radically reduce its greenhouse gas emissions, which is also something we're working very hard on trying to encourage. But reduction in greenhouse gas emissions will not have much of an impact on sea level rise and other impacts for years because of the heat that is literally baked into the climate system. So if there are 100 million people displaced by climate change, to pick a round number, and if the US is responsible for 25% of it, the math is easy about how many people we should take in. The domestic politics make that utterly inconceivable. The US once opened its arms to immigrants, but we're not doing that so much anymore. And here I come back to the role of faith communities. I am not a biblical scholar, but by any means, but I did find this list of passages from the Old Testament and the New Testament, in which we hear over and over again passages like this from Matthew: "For I was hungry and you gave me food, I was thirsty and you gave me drink, I was a stranger and you welcomed me." Over and over again, we see these kinds of things in the Old Testament and the New Testament. And around the United States and Canada and some other parts of the world, we see faith communities stepping up. We see religious communities welcoming immigrants and refugees. And that is a sign of fairness. It's a sign of morality. It's a sign of compassion. Is consistent with what I and others heard from the Pope at this conference in Vatican City, what all of us have heard and read in Laudato Si. And it is a mission that I think is very important for faith communities of all kinds to embrace and act upon.
Thank you, Professor Gerrard. That was really great. My name is Ben Poulos. I'm the other co-chair of Social Justice Action, and I'm going to move us into the Q&A portion. I'm actually going to start with a question that was submitted in advance from Ann and Doug Courier. This is a very New York specific question. And they ask, what would you advise the new director of the Mayor's Office of Climate and Sustainability to set as a primary objective or action to reduce New York City's contribution to climate change?
So the two largest sources of greenhouse gas emissions in New York City are motor vehicles and buildings. The emissions from motor vehicles are mostly determined by the fuel economy of the vehicles, and that's set by Washington. And there's now litigation about that. President Trump softened the standards. President Biden is strengthening them again. But in addition to making the cars cleaner, we want less use of them. So to the extent we can improve mass transit and have better, safer bicycle lanes, more pedestrian-friendly streets. We've seen during the pandemic that a lot of street space has been turned over to restaurants and so forth, and I think that kind of thing ought to be maintained. The city has a lot more control over emissions from buildings, and there's a law called Local Law 97 passed about 3 years ago, which is going to require a lot cleaner emissions from buildings, conversion from natural gas and oil heating to electricity. Just today, Mayor de Blasio announced moving forward with the purchase of a good deal of clean energy from Hydro-Quebec. The state needs a massive increase in wind and solar. The nuclear power plant, Indian Point nuclear power plant, is finally shutting down in about 10 days, and will be in the short term replaced by natural gas. We need to get rid of all the natural gas to burn electricity. There's no coal used anymore for electricity, and virtually no oil, but a lot of natural gas. We need to stop building natural gas pipelines. Corinna Gore has been particularly active in that important fight. We need to stop building natural gas power plants. We need to build out a huge amount of wind and solar, including offshore wind, and communities where these are located, I very much hope, will accept these facilities and not fight against them, which is what happens very often.
Thank you. We have a second question. How would you describe the feelings or beliefs of Columbia law students or the younger generation of law students about climate change? How is it influencing their career path or choices of practice?
So I certainly see a considerable amount of interest in climate change among the law students, and even to a greater extent among the undergraduates at Columbia. It is still not the principal practice area that most go into. In the first place, the United States does not have a law on climate change. Although I teach a course called Climate Change Law and have written books on the subject, it's cobbled together a lot of pre-existing, often 30 to 50-year-old laws. And so it's not really a practice area. There are a very limited number of jobs out there to actually do climate change law, although there's an increasing number of jobs to do what's necessary to fight climate change, to build out all these renewables. But I would say we have a core group of people in the law school, of students in the law school, who have an interest, a strong interest in environmental issues in general and climate change in particular, but it's still, a pretty small percentage.
Thanks for that. Sorry, I realized I should introduce myself. I'm Liz. I'm from SJA at St. Boniface. And we have another question. What actions, you certainly touched on this, Michael, but what actions can communities of faith take to advance the messages that you're sharing in this presentation? There's certainly some very stark realities that you exposed for us today.
I think talking about immigration is one very important thing, to make it clear that the United States should return to the position we once had of being, the Statue of Liberty, welcoming the poor, the huddled masses. We now largely reject them. And the voices in favor of allowing immigration tend to be few and far between and soft. In most places, I think more voices need to be raised about how, for many reasons, for economic reasons as well, because these people do jobs that U.S. citizens don't want to do. But I think for the reasons of ethics and morality that I talk about, it's important for faith communities to raise their voices and talk about where we should be welcoming these populations, not spurning them.
We certainly agree with you at SJA. So this is from Father Mark. You have grandchildren. What do you think their future is? What do you hope will happen for them?
So I have two little grandchildren. One was born in 2018. One was born in 2020. They should still be around in the year 2100. And thinking about the kind of world they will grow into is one of my greatest motivations for fighting climate change, because I really do have great concerns about what this little boy and this little girl will grow into. I have these great concerns, and I think all of us who have children or grandchildren or are thinking about children or grandchildren should have that foremost in their minds. And that's why I think it's very important, as well as, I must say, very fulfilling to devote ourselves to this fight. We don't know how much success we will have, but it's a fight worth having. It's a fight where we can have an impact, and the futures of our children and our grandchildren really do depend on it. So we really need to do this, and if we do this, I think we will find it a fulfilling life.
Thank you. We have a question from Maria in the chat. Professor, I've heard that wind and solar will not be sufficient to produce the amount of power we need to function. Are you able to comment on that?
So we need a variety of energy sources. I think wind and solar will be the two largest, but we also need hydro and geothermal, and there's work on tidal. There is now work on new nuclear technologies. So they may be 10 or 20 or 30 years away from being safe and large enough in a commercial application, but I think that kind of research and development should proceed. There's no question that it is possible to build enough renewable energy capacity, wind and solar and hydro and geothermal and so forth, to serve the world's energy needs. Now, this has to be coupled with energy efficiency, with greatly reducing the amount of energy we use. And those of us in we saw how the wealthiest 10% are generating half the carbon dioxide emissions. We need to be more frugal. We need to consume less and be less and be more efficient. But when you do all of that, all the numbers I have seen show that the lines can cross, that you can generate enough clean energy to meet the world's needs.
Michael, can you describe, or is there a legal definition of a climate refugee? And how would a person claim this right or position?
Yeah, as I was trying to say, there isn't one. Right now, they do not fit within the definition of what a refugee is under the United Nations Refugee Convention of 1951, which is the applicable law. It's been litigated a couple of times in the courts of New Zealand, where people from another threatened island nation, Kiribati, tried to claim citizenship, and the courts in New Zealand said, no, we're sorry, but this doesn't fit within the definition. The court, or a UN tribunal, said the time may come when some of these nations are so endangered that it's incumbent upon countries to take them in, but that hasn't happened yet. There's active discussion of whether the Refugee Convention should be amended to deal with climate refugees. One problem is that the refugee system is designed mostly to adjudicate individual cases. But that doesn't work if you have 10 million people from Bangladesh trying to flee. We need a more systemic kind of approach. There are a number of voluntary, agreements that have been formed, and the United Nations has talked about, has actually enunciated principles for dealing with people who are displaced by both natural disasters and conflict, but it's not binding on anyone. These are principles that people can look at, but they're not binding, and very few countries are actually following them.
Yeah. Another in the chat. How can we frame effective arguments to persuade communities to accept wind or solar or other kinds of renewable energy facilities?
So most of the adverse impacts that are attributed to wind and solar are actually not accurate, or not accurate with respect to the current technology. Some of them were accurate at one time, but we have more modern technologies. But this kind of local resistance is a major problem. And so my center founded something called the Renewable Energy Legal Defense Initiative, which provides pro bono legal help to communities that want wind and solar in their communities. There's a lot of talk about community compensation, compensating communities that host these facilities. New York has a law that was passed about 1.5 years ago that is trying to move in that direction. But I also have to say, I think that we're going to have to put a lot of wind farms on top of a lot of hills. That's where the wind is. And these are also the most visible places. And so there are people who don't like looking at wind turbines. But I think we have to live with it. We've sort of blown the chance not to have a wind turbine in your view, or to avoid these other impacts. And the reason we've blown the chance is that all of us have been generating so much CO2. So I think we have to accept that we need these facilities, and it's also going to allow shutting down these old fossil fuel power plants, which are disproportionately located in disadvantaged communities and are a profound environmental injustice because of the health impacts that these local pollutants have. So an additional reason to accept this wind and solar and so forth is to shut down these highly polluting facilities.
I think we have time for 1 or 2 more questions. And Mary Ellen Kramer asks, we've seen documentaries about the extraordinary impact that cows have on the environment. It seems this cause does not get highlighted in most writings. Can you comment on this?
So that's true. There's beef. Eating beef is the least efficient way of consuming protein, both in terms of the greenhouse gas emissions and land consumption and water consumption, because of what it takes to the many pounds of feed it takes to make a pound of hamburger. And so one of the most important personal consumption actions that people can take is to eat less beef. Now, that's sometimes hard to talk about, and certainly one can't conceive of Congress, the way it's constituted, passing an anti-beef law. But as a matter of personal consumption, it really is true, and has been demonstrated in a number of scientific studies that eating beef has a tremendously negative environmental impact.
Thank you for that. So we have time for 1 more question, and it's from Michael Doyle. He has a question regarding the connection between human trafficking and climate change, which was so vivid in your talk. He says, I understand the people who run human trafficking rings can be prosecuted, but I'm curious as to whether there are organizations who actively seek to track down the vulnerable people who've been trafficked. This seems like a major moral imperative to me.
There are a number of NGOs that are active in fighting trafficking, and there are a number of prosecutorial offices that are devoted to going against traffickers. There's an office within the U.S. State Department that is devoted to that. I don't know if there are NGOs that are actually doing the tracking them down. I'm not aware of that. I think that would be a worthwhile thing. And I think some of that happens on a small scale, but I'm not aware that any of it happens on a very large scale.
Thank you. So I think that will close out our Q&A portion. Thanks everyone for sharing your insightful observations and questions. And I'm going to throw it over to John.
Thank you. Thank you, Liz. Thank you, Ben. And thank you, Michael, for that. I will say I grew up in rural Eastern Washington state, and my grandfather was one of the first people in the valley that I grew up in to have a windmill that generated power. It was a very early generation windmill, and so it often spent more time on the ground being repaired than it did generating power, but it was something that 40 years ago was, that technology existed, and it's only better now. And we're going to give people a chance to take action tonight. So I'll introduce Senator Kavanaugh first. Senator Kavanaugh represents the 26th Senate District, which represents parts of Manhattan facing Brooklyn and Brooklyn facing Manhattan, if you will. He's the chair of the Senate's House Construction and Community Development Committee, which was instrumental in passing the 2019 Housing Stability and Tenant Protection Act, which gave New York one of the toughest tenant protections in the nation. Senator Kavanaugh is a leader on environmental issues. He's co-sponsored the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act, which was enacted in 2019 as well, which mandated huge cuts in climate pollution, investment in clean energy, creation of green jobs, and promoting environmental justice. He's also working currently in the current legislative session to pass the Extended Producer Responsibility Act, which would place the responsibility for packaging not on the consumers like you and I, but actually on the producers. Senator, I'm going to turn it over to you for a couple of minutes to talk about the ERP and other things going on.
Hi there. First of all, thank you. Really is a pleasure and an honor to be with you. And also, I'm a little embarrassed to have been introduced twice tonight. Things are still really hectic in Albany, and I was in a couple of meetings that I just could not get myself away from. We still have a few emergencies we're dealing with, especially in housing, with the current moratorium on evictions ending in 10 days. So we're working on that. But I really am very happy to be with you. And I was asked to speak for 2 minutes, so I'm going to try to be quick. But just like we're in a situation where in New York State for many, many years, we talked a lot about the need for kind of really aggressive action. And it was very difficult to do that at the state level because of very different opinions about those issues coming from the Senate and the Assembly. The Senate was controlled by Republicans who, for better or worse, have found it increasingly difficult to take bold action on these things. So in the last, just about 2 years ago, for the first time, we had strong majorities in both houses, and we stepped forward and passed the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act, which really is, we believe, the strongest set of overall state level frameworks that are in place in the United States. Unfortunately, of course, the standard, that's not the standard where we need to be, and there are many states, including New York, need to take a lot of additional action. We are working on a bill that is sort of parallel to that, which is it's a bill called the Climate Community Investment Act, which seeks to ensure that a lot of funding is going to our efforts to fight climate change. And we're pushing forward a $3 billion bond act, which should be on the ballot this November, so that we could also begin to spend some real, public money on that. I was asked to talk about what's sometimes called product stewardship and sometimes called extended producer responsibility. This is the notion that if you produce a product, you, the producer, are in the best position to, first of all, produce the product in a way that it can be efficiently reused or recycled, and then, of course, take responsibility for actually taking it back and doing something with it. So our very early examples of that are like the bottle bill. We have required recycling for electronics, but still the bulk of our waste goes into our waste stream and into our landfills. So a couple of items. We've got a bill it's Senate Bill 1185. It's sponsored by Senator Kaminsky, the chair of our Environmental Conservation Committee. It would create a broad-based extended producer responsibility program for paper and packaging products, which are a surprising percentage of our waste stream. And again, I'm not going to go into the details because that's not the 2-minute version, but a very big opportunity. I also just want to mention another thing, which is carpeting. New York State, you might be surprised to know, generates 515 million pounds of carpet waste every year. Carpeting is substantially produced from petroleum and has lots of toxins in it. So we have been working for a while on a program that would require a extended producer responsibility for that product as well. It's something that we've worked with League of Conservation Voters and Environmental Advocates in New York and others on, and think we might have a shot of doing that as well. That bill is S5027. It's my bill in the Senate, and I expect we'll have a strong Assembly sponsor in the next couple of days, but I just thought I'd put in a plug for that as well. And I think I'll stop there. I'm happy to do questions or not. And I also really enjoyed being here to listen to Professor Gerrard's presentation and the Q&A around that as well. So thank you.
Thank you, Senator. So tonight, this has been really exciting. I want to, the committee actually put on the event and the Social Justice Committee is, we want to highlight specifically one of the organizations that Michael talked about specifically. It's the Marshallese Educational Initiative, which is a nonprofit that's actually based in Arkansas that works with the Marshallese community that's there, helping them work with, get higher educational attainment, build community, if you will, there as a way to sort of address not only the problems that have sprung out of COVID-19 this year, as all the things that Michael said. We're actually making a gift in Michael's honor, and I'm going to share with you the link to that. So we'd encourage anyone participating tonight to also go on and support, that initiative, even if it's just in a little way. It's just one way of doing something concrete tonight after all that's said and done. We're getting close to the end. So it's my, I just want to thank everyone. I'm sorry, I'm getting flustered for being here. I'm excited to hand it off to our other pastor, Father Michael, and from the Assumption of the Blessed Virgin Mary. Father Michael, take it away. It's your show to end.
That's my show to end. Wow. Thank you all. First of all, great presentation. Great to see so many of you here and to be with you. Professor Gerrard, everybody calls you Michael. We haven't met, but I'll call you Michael. It's a great name. Really terrific. Thank you so much for your presentation. One of the things I was asked to sort of tie this in with Laudato Si. The Pope is probably the best evangelist and a champion for climate change and really speaking to that. Laudato Si had a number of points, and I just want to kind of touch on a few. First of all, I think what's really important about Laudato Si is that it makes this not a political or an economic or a socioeconomic or a cultural issue. This makes it a spiritual issue. This is about the very core of the human person. And Francis sees this as tied in with the very essence of our humanity. Whether you're Catholic or Christian or not Christian or religious, he sees this as tied into the very core of our humanity as created beings, as people that share this earth. And so the spiritual aspect is so, so important. I think it's going to be what sustains people as we try to accomplish things that are concrete. The second thing I think it's really important is that he doesn't do any science. He just accepts the science. He understands that scientists know what they're doing and what they're saying and what they're teaching us, and that he wants to hear that and listen to it, and he wants to encourage us to do the same. That we can't go, well, who knows? Who really knows? He really buys the fact that people who are doing this work, who are studying the data, know what they're talking about. He has these conferences, as Michael pointed out, to bring those people together to try to have better impact. So it's a tremendous thing. It's really clear in the Pope's teachings from Laudato Si, and since then, I really want to encourage you, let us dream. He talks about the disproportionate impact of all of the issues of climate change on the poor, all the issues of economics on the poor. The disproportionality was stark on those maps, right? You could just see it. And I think, how do you get to any kind of parity? How do you get to any kind of justice is got to be part of this. Laudato Si rooted that. And by doing it, it put climate change and everything that is attached to it dead center in Catholic social teaching. So this is no longer a peripheral issue. It's not going to be if this Pope likes it or doesn't like it. It's not a personal predilection for caring about the earth. That this is now situated this as core and center to our social teaching, to our spirituality. And it's really clear that it's very, very much part of the Pope's spirituality. Everything he thinks is connected. He sees the connectivity of our lives, of our earth, of us and how we relate to the earth. And he challenges us. One of the lines in Laudato Si is, He refers to the cry of the earth and the cry of the poor, that these are completely interrelated. Immigrants, those who are trafficked, all of the people who are dispossessed, those are going to be dispossessed by loss of their climate, but those have been dispossessed by all the other things that have occurred, like in the Marshall Islands in the past. Those are the things we have to address, and that this is really, really a spiritual effort, not just a political or a sociological effort, but this is a spiritual effort. And so for us as people of faith, we have to keep ourselves grounded and rooted, I think, in those things that sustain us. In prayer, in scripture, he roots us very clearly, and he calls the gospel of creation. He roots this in our common prayer. He roots this in our common heritage as human beings, all of whom he believes are touched by the Spirit of God. So I think it's critically important for us not to lose sight of this. And the last thing I'll say, because I know we're coming up on, it's 8:27, and I'm gonna like to close this with a prayer from the Pope, if I may, that he wrote on the earth. Is that okay? Thanks. So he says this: all-powerful God, you are present in the whole universe and in the smallest of your creatures. You embrace with your tenderness all that exists. Pour out upon us the power of your love, that we may protect life and beauty. Fill us with peace, that we may live as brothers and sisters, harming no one. O God of the poor, help us to rescue the abandoned and forgotten of this earth, so precious in your eyes. Bring healing to our lives, that we may protect the world and not prey on it, that we may sow beauty, not pollution and destruction. Touch the hearts of those who look only for gain at the expense of the poor and of the earth. Teach us to discover the worth of each thing, to be filled with awe and contemplation, to recognize that we are profoundly united with every creature as we journey towards your infinite light. We thank you for being with us each day. Encourage us, we pray, in our struggle for justice, love, and peace. Amen.
Amen. Thank you, Michael. Thank you, Michael. Thank you, Senator Kavanaugh. Thank you, Corinna. Thank you to all of our sponsors and to the team at Social Justice Action that helped me. And I'm glad you all were here and enjoyed it. So have a good night, everyone.